we're on chapter 1 now, How Addiction Happens, in the Recovery Skills Workbook. So the first sentence says, think back to the first time you realized that your control over your use of alcohol or drugs was slipping away from you. So this is something that's a really great exercise, because it's not often that we're able to really look at our drug and alcohol use and reflect on it and connect the dots. Even if we've been sober for a while or we're later in the recovery process, it's always good to have this reminder. What I want to do is this exercise. So everybody sort of remember back to the first time that they've used substances, whether it be cannabis, alcohol, or their drug of choice. You want to think about when that first time was, or if it's hard to remember the exact first time, just try to come up with one of the first times that you used. Imagine the feelings around that. Who was able to guide you through that process? Who did you use with? What were the emotions around using? Excitement, anticipation, fear maybe. What is it going to feel like? And then now I want you to go ahead and think about another time point. And that's when your substance use became a daily problem. Like your use became regular and daily. You don't have to remember the exact point that it transitioned, but just think about a ballpark of when that was. Were you in your early 20s, mid-20s, late 20s, early teens, mid-teens, late teens, so on and so forth? And then start thinking, how did that feel? What did that look like? What was your daily grind? Did you use right when you woke up? How did you use? And then the third milestone that's helpful to remember is when things started getting out of control. When did things start getting out of control? And when do you think you started to have an addiction? So that first milestone, in a lot of ways, it helps us to think about what were the risk factors that led to the drug use. And then the second milestone, it's helpful to see what were the conditions that led to us needing to regularly use drugs and alcohol. And then the third milestone, it's helpful to see when did we start to make that transition into addiction? When did you start realizing that you started to lose control over your drug and alcohol use? So the second paragraph talks about how is addiction diagnosed. It goes into how you can get into a textbook definition of it, how you can get into a really precise technical definition of it, but most people can probably define it just as well by reflecting on their own experience. What led you to believe that you needed help with the drug and alcohol problem? Also, it's helpful to remember, when did somebody start to bring up your drug and alcohol use as a problem? They start talking on the second page of this chapter, on page 10, the 3 reasons why people typically use substances. First reason is to feel good. The second reason is to escape not feeling well. And the third reason is to enhance your performance. And it can be one or all of these reasons. Eventually, it's all of these reasons. So even though we started to use substances to feel good, eventually the tolerance and withdrawal happens and we start to use it just to not feel bad. And then eventually, in order to keep our lives together, we needed the substances just to perform and enhance our performance, or even bring it to a normal level of performance. Then it talks about how regardless of the reason you were drawn to alcohol or drugs in the beginning, it worked. You knew you could count on feeling that sensation. It says on page 11, how do you know when you're addicted? It's when that need to drink or use drugs to feel normal starts to override most of the other things you value in life. And it goes into a story, Charlie's story, on page 11, where it talks about basically how in this 23-year-old man, how drugs and alcohol slowly took over their life and started to become a problem. I'm going to go ahead and just jump into page 13, where it has an exercise called Addiction Signs and Symptoms. All right, so what's the point of this? Many of us know we're addicted and have an addiction problem. So why do we need to go into this? Because we already got to the point where we feel we have an addiction and we are working on it. Going through this exercise here is helpful for two reasons. One is it helps us to get an understanding of what does that mean, an addiction. And then number two, it's really a great motivating factor, looking at the reasons of why the addiction occurred. So exercise 1.1 talks about addiction signs and symptoms. So the first sign it talks about is tolerance. So when we started needing more of the drug to get the desired effect, tolerance is a sign of addiction starting, or a sign that addiction may be happening, but it's also a great motivating factor to stop using the drugs. At those points where we start thinking about using drugs again, or going back to the drug and alcohol use, sometimes remembering, playing the tape through, that tolerance comes back. So for many of us, when we play the tape through, the drugs and alcohol get to a point where it's not even working for us anymore. It doesn't provide that adequate satisfaction. Or we develop a tolerance so fast to it again that it's short-lived. So if you think about that first cycle of drug use where it was really exciting in the beginning, and then you eventually develop a tolerance, and then it stops sort of working for you, and you're sort of just using drugs and alcohol to feel better or just not feel bad. And then you go to rehab or you get a break, and then you go through another cycle of drug use. That process of going from it feeling good to it not working anymore gets shorter and shorter for many of us. And sometimes it gets to the point where it's just not even worth it anymore. And it's helpful to keep that up front so that when we are getting periods of sobriety, to play that tape through when drug use really feels appealing. The second sign they talk about is withdrawal. That's a sign that, again, a sign that things are getting bad, or a sign of addiction, but also a great motivating factor to get out of the game and stay out of the game. So withdrawal for many of us gets really bad. So if you don't have a severe withdrawal symptom, just simply getting off of drugs and feeling that sort of low feeling, or that anxious feeling, or that just kind of depressed feeling afterwards is enough. And then if you have a substance that you use where it's a severe withdrawal symptom, alcohol withdrawal, opioid withdrawal, the insomnia, the crawling out of your skin, so on and so forth. The third sign they talk about is cravings. So cravings, again, a sign that addiction's getting bad, but also a great motivating factor not to go back to using. Because once we go back to using, no matter how bad your cravings are, when you give into that craving, the cravings get worse. So once you give into that craving, now the cravings are going to come back even stronger and more intrusive. Cravings being these intrusive thoughts that you can't wish away. Even if you wanted to wish them away, you're sort of stuck with them unless you know how to work through them. The fourth sign being a loss of control. So this one, again, a sign of addiction's getting bad and a reason not to go back to using drugs and alcohol, where things just sort of got out of hand. So work stuff, school stuff, family relationships really getting out of hand, things getting dark, things getting ugly, needing to do worse and worse things to make it through the day, through the week. So that loss of control. And then it goes and talks about legal problems. So the legal problems, the school problems, the work problems, the relationship problems, all the ultimatums we get. Stop using drugs or go back to jail or prison or probation or parole. Stop using drugs or I'm going to leave you. Stop using drugs or you're going to lose your job, your school. And then it goes into the next sign, problems in social or occupational functioning. Job and relationships and school. And then finally, the last sign they talk about is persistent use despite negative consequences. Again, a sign that addiction's getting bad, and then a reason not to go back to it. Because despite all this bad stuff, besides hitting a new low or hitting a new level of things getting bad, something in us still drives us through it to continue to use drugs and alcohol. There's one more: impairment or distress resulting from use. This is a really good opportunity to not just have this ill-defined feeling of I have an addiction, things are bad, but to really look into detail of what does that mean for me? What is my addiction? How does that look? And it's going to look different for each one of us. By defining it, you also have defined a list of reasons of why you don't want to go back to using drugs and alcohol. And just like there's a slow process to developing a drug problem, there's that first time that we use, there's the first time that we start using every day, and then there's that first time where things start getting out of control. Unfortunately, we can't walk ourselves back out of drug use. So we can't walk ourselves back out to just going back to a level of daily drug use where things are not so bad and the consequences are not so bad. And then we can't walk ourselves back to just using drugs a couple days out of the week or on the weekend. And then we can't walk ourselves back out to just use drugs once every month or once every couple months. Many of us require an abstinence-based program. And it touches on this on page 15. For many of us, using drugs or alcohol in moderation, it's just not satisfying. It's more difficult than actually just staying away from the drugs or alcohol. It's like starving and then having to go around food without eating. It's more uncomfortable than actually staying away from the drugs and alcohol. Moderating drugs and alcohol is just unsatisfying. So unfortunately, once we develop the problem of addiction, moderation is no longer something that many of us have the ability to do anymore. And so although we step into drug and alcohol use, maybe because of depression or anxiety, or maybe because of grief, or maybe because of some stressful life situation, even though we enter into drug and alcohol use through that, once we use it daily and we have those changes in the brain that are characteristic of addiction, now we have two problems. We have that first problem as to why we use drugs and alcohol. Then we have that second problem, which is addiction. So we need to address both of those problems, both the addiction and then the reasons to why we started drugs and alcohol in the first place.